What's going on, everyone? Let me tell you about something that absolutely dominated the conversation on NBA Today earlier this afternoon, that has the entire Knicks community buzzing with anticipation and excitement about a potential roster move that could solve multiple problems simultaneously. I'm talking about the kind of trade target that makes so much sense from every conceivable angle that you almost can't believe it hasn't happened already. The type of acquisition that would address glaring weaknesses while also adding a player who's familiar with the market and the intensity of playing in New York. This isn't just about bringing in another rotation piece or depth addition. This is about potentially acquiring a starting caliber center who could transform the Knicks' defensive identity and give them the interior presence they've been desperately lacking all season long. So settle in, because what I'm about to share from today's ESPN broadcast isn't just about one player potentially changing teams. It's about organizational needs, about the trade market materializing, about championship aspirations, and about whether the Knicks are willing to be aggressive enough to get the pieces they need to truly contend. All right, here's the situation that had the entire NBA Today panel absolutely locked in this afternoon. And I'm talking about veteran NBA analysts who cover the trade deadline every single year, but couldn't hide their excitement about how perfectly Nick Claxton would fit with what the Knicks are trying to do. The main story that emerged from today's broadcast wasn't actually about Javante Carter being on the Knicks' radar as a backup point guard, although that did get discussed extensively and we'll get to it. It was about the persistent speculation that Nick Claxton could potentially be available from the Brooklyn Nets, and why he represents exactly the type of front-court addition that the Knicks desperately need, despite their apparent focus on finding a backup point guard. When you really break down what Claxton brings to the table, when you see how his skill set would complement what New York already has, when you understand the Nets' willingness to potentially move pieces, it becomes clear that this is more than just media members creating content. This is a legitimate possibility that could happen. Hey, what's up, everyone? Before we jump into this massive Knicks news, I just want to ask you for a quick favor that would mean the world to me. If you could just take 1 second right now and hit that like button, it would be incredibly important to me and helps this channel grow so much. I know it seems like a small thing, but those likes genuinely make a huge difference in getting this content out to more Knicks fans who need to stay updated on everything happening with this team. So seriously, just tap that like button real quick. It literally takes 1 second, and it helps me out more than you know. Let me start by giving you the full context that NBA Today was establishing right at the beginning of the broadcast, because understanding both the Knicks' needs and Claxton's situation in Brooklyn is absolutely essential for grasping why this potential trade keeps coming up in conversations. The Knicks are currently 6th in the Eastern Conference standings at plus 1,500 to win the NBA Finals, according to FanDuel, which is actually pretty good odds considering how they've played lately. But everyone who watches this team knows they have glaring weaknesses, particularly in the front court, where they lack a true rim-protecting center who can anchor the defense and control the paint. Mitchell Robinson has been inconsistent and injury-prone. Karl Anthony Towns is playing out of position at center in many lineups, and the overall lack of size and defensive presence in the middle has been exploited repeatedly by teams with dominant big men. But here's what really got the NBA Today analysts fired up about the Claxton possibility. And this is where you see how perfectly all the pieces would fit together. Claxton is a 25-year-old center who's already established himself as one of the better defensive big men in the NBA. He's averaging career highs in several categories this season. He's a legitimate shot blocker and rim protector who can change everything at the basket. And most importantly, he's on a Brooklyn Nets team that's clearly going nowhere and might be willing to move pieces if the price is right. The ESPN crew was showing highlights of Claxton erasing shots at the rim, switching onto guards on the perimeter, finishing lobs in pick-and-roll situations, doing all the things that would make him invaluable to a Knicks team that desperately needs exactly those skills. The show dove deep into Claxton's specific skill set and why he'd be such a perfect fit for Tom Thibodeau's defensive system. And here's where you really see the basketball fit becoming undeniable. Claxton is averaging over 2 blocks per game this season, which puts him among the league leaders in that category. His defensive rating is excellent, and he has the mobility and switchability to guard multiple positions, which is crucial in today's NBA. The NBA Today panel was discussing how Thibodeau's defense is predicated on having an anchor in the middle who can protect the rim and allow the perimeter defenders to be more aggressive. And Claxton would provide exactly that. He'd instantly become the best defensive center the Knicks have had in years. What the ESPN crew kept emphasizing, and I think this is absolutely critical for understanding why this move makes sense strategically, is that Claxton is still young enough to fit the Knicks' timeline with Jalen Brunson and their other core pieces. At only 25 years old, he's entering his prime years and could be a foundational defensive player for the next 5 to 7 seasons. The analysts were contrasting that with some of the other centers the Knicks have been linked to in trade rumors, guys who are older and on the downside of their careers, and pointing out that Claxton gives you both immediate impact and long-term security at the position. The panel spent extensive time analyzing what a potential trade package would look like and whether the Knicks have the assets to make it happen without gutting their roster. And this sparked really interesting debates about asset valuation and organizational philosophy. The Nets presumably would want young players and draft picks in return for Claxton. They're not looking for win-now veterans since they're rebuilding. The NBA Today analysts were suggesting packages that might include someone like Precious Achiuwa or other young players the Knicks could part with, plus potentially a protected first-round pick or multiple second-rounders. The question is whether Brooklyn would accept that return or if they'd demand more significant assets. What I found particularly fascinating during today's NBA Today discussion was when they started connecting the Claxton speculation to Ian Begley's reporting about the Knicks' actual trade deadline priority. According to Begley, New York is focused on finding a backup point guard rather than front-court help, which seems counterintuitive given their obvious needs in the paint. The ESPN panel was debating whether that's smoke being put out to disguise their real intentions, or if the front office genuinely believes their center situation is manageable and the backup point guard spot is the bigger concern. Some analysts argued that Leon Rose and the front office might be targeting both positions, that they could make multiple moves at the deadline rather than just one. The show also explored why Brooklyn might be willing to move Claxton despite him being one of their best young players. And this is where the Nets' organizational situation becomes relevant. Brooklyn is clearly not competing for a championship this season. They're trying to accumulate assets and build for the future. And Claxton has some injury history that might make them hesitant to commit to him long-term with a massive extension. The NBA Today analysts were discussing how if the Nets could get good draft capital for Claxton now, they might prefer that to potentially losing him for nothing in free agency or being forced to pay him more than they're comfortable with to keep him. What really struck me during the ESPN analysis was when they started discussing the impact Claxton would have on the Knicks' championship odds and playoff prospects. New York is currently 6th on FanDuel's championship odds list, behind OKC, Denver, Cleveland, Houston, and the Lakers. And that feels about right, given their current roster construction. But the analysts were suggesting that adding a player like Claxton, who addresses their biggest weakness, could legitimately bump them up to 4th or even 3rd on that list, could change how other teams view them as a playoff threat. When you have elite defense anchored by a rim protector, you can win playoff games even when shots aren't falling, and that's invaluable in the postseason. The panel also spent significant time discussing the Javante Carter possibility that Begley reported on. And honestly, this was interesting because it shows the Knicks are definitely going to make some kind of move at the deadline, even if it's not Claxton. Carter is a veteran defensive-minded point guard who can shoot threes and rarely turns the ball over. Exactly the type of steady backup presence you want behind Jalen Brunson. The NBA Today crew was breaking down how Carter's 42% three-point shooting during his time in Milwaukee made him one of the most efficient backup guards in the league, how his defensive rating consistently ranks near the top of whatever team he's on, how he's the definition of a low-usage, high-efficiency role player who just does his job without needing plays run for him. One aspect that got really interesting discussion on NBA Today was the salary matching complications of potential trades and which Knicks players might be included to make the money work. The analysts kept bringing up Precious Achiuwa, who's been disappointing this season and whose salary could help match in a trade for either Claxton or Carter. They also mentioned Miles McBride as someone who has value around the league but might be expendable if the Knicks are adding another guard. The ESPN panel was discussing how Leon Rose has shown he's willing to make tough decisions and move on from players who aren't producing. So nobody on the roster should feel completely safe if the right deal presents itself. What I loved about today's NBA Today coverage was how they connected all these potential moves to the broader narrative of the Knicks' championship window and whether they're truly one or two pieces away from contending. The consensus among the panel seemed to be that New York has a really good core with Brunson, Towns, Bridges, and others, but they're missing that defensive anchor in the middle and that reliable backup guard who can spell Brunson without the offense completely stalling. If they can address both those needs at the deadline, suddenly they're a much more dangerous team that nobody wants to face in a playoff series. Listen, after watching the entire NBA Today segment this afternoon about the Knicks' trade deadline plans and the possibility of Nick Claxton potentially being available, I'm absolutely convinced that Leon Rose and the front office need to be aggressive about pursuing him, even if their public comments suggest they're focused elsewhere. Claxton solves so many problems for this team: the lack of rim protection, the need for a defensive anchor, the shortage of athletes who can finish lobs and run the floor. Yes, they also need a backup point guard, and Carter makes sense there. But the center position is where the Knicks are most vulnerable and where adding an impact player would have the biggest effect on their championship odds. If the Nets are willing to deal Claxton for a reasonable package, the Knicks should absolutely do whatever it takes to get him in a New York uniform before the deadline passes.